Over on Jaguar 7, a new baseball video is out. In this video, we talk about the player on the Chicago White Sox who retired and then unretired in the span of one day. Click the card in the upper right corner to watch. And now, on with our feature presentation. When the Los Angeles Chargers make their first round pick in this year's NFL Draft, in all likelihood, it's going to be incredibly straightforward. I don't necessarily mean the pick itself, because they could surprise some people and go well off the charted course, or they could trade up or down, but I mean in terms of contacting the prospect. The team will call up the player, they'll have that player's number ready to go, and contacting the player will be as easy as pie. There's no guesswork. There's no hunting down the player to try and figure out his whereabouts or what his intentions are about playing at the next level. The stressful part about the entire process for the front office will be determining who to pick. Once they made up their mind, though, it becomes incredibly straightforward, and making the call and tracking the prospect down, especially in today's day and age with cameras on these players and social media and whatnot, is a formality. In 1974, however, that was not the case. Because the man that you've been watching this whole time is San Diego Chargers running back Bo Matthews, and the process to draft him was unlike anything that we've ever seen. You won't believe the lengths that the Chargers went to draft Matthews and make sure that he was going to play for the team, because I'm not kidding or over-exaggerating when I say that the process behind this pick, if done correctly, could be a movie. And with the lengths that the Chargers went to taking this player, you'll probably be disappointed with how his career panned out, because nothing could possibly live up to the grand entrance that he created for himself. Because this is the story behind, quite possibly, the most chaotic draft and the most chaotic first-round pick in the over 60-year history of the Chargers franchise. Before I talk about the pick and what the Chargers did in order to draft him, we need some context to understand not just how good he was, but also to understand the football landscape at the time. During the early 1970s, if you were looking for a good running back to watch in college football who was an absolute bulldozer and had tons of power behind him, a la John Riggins, you looked to Colorado and looked at the man that you've been watching this whole time, Bo Matthews. The Buffaloes weren't exactly a good football team during that time. Heck, in 1973, they finished with a losing record. But you couldn't blame Matthews for any of that. Not at all. Because every time Matthews got the ball in his hands, he made opposing defenders fear him with his strength. At his peak, trying to tackle or block the 6'4", 230-pound running back was like trying to take on a semi-truck in the cold weather. You couldn't do it by yourself, and if you did somehow do it, it was going to hurt like crazy. You were going to feel it. Over his final 2 seasons with the Buffaloes, Matthews had 1,208 rushing yards and 9 rushing touchdowns on 4.8 yards per carry, finishing among the leaders of the Big 8 in just about every major statistical category. He was an exceptional complement in the backfield to Charlie Davis, so while his stats might not seem too impressive in total, keep in mind that he absolutely passed the eye test, even after missing some time with kneecap surgery, and he was in a backfield with 2 guys who would eventually get drafted inside the top 50 of the NFL draft. Long story short, Matthews was good. He had a great Senior Bowl, and just about everyone knew that he was going to be drafted relatively high in the 1974 NFL Draft. And that was really good news for the Chargers, who had the number 2 pick that year, because they desperately needed help in the running game. The Chargers were a train wreck in 1973, and that's putting it lightly, seeing as they went 2-11-1, replaced coaches midway through the season, and lost their final 4 games by a combined score of 136-51, or an average of over 21 points per game. There were many reasons for the Chargers being bad that year, but one of the main ones was a poor offense that averaged just 13.4 points per game, finishing 25th in the NFL out of 26 teams, and only placing ahead of the New Orleans Saints for dead last in the league. And part of why that offense was terrible was because of an ineffective running game that ranked in the bottom 10 in rushing yards and rushing touchdowns. Not only did the team score just 9 touchdowns on the ground, but outside of Sid Edwards, no one had more than 1 rushing touchdown. Not only did they lack productive runners, as their leading rusher was Sid Edwards, who had 609 yards, which was 28th, meaning that there were teams that had multiple runners more productive than San Diego's top guy, but they lack youthful runners as well. 4 players on the Chargers had over 100 rushing yards in 1973. Those guys were Sid Edwards, Mike Garrett, Robert Holmes, and Clint Jones. Their ages heading into the 1974 season were 31, 30, 29, and 29, respectively. That is way past your prime if you're a running back, and to have an entire room full of veterans on the verge of retiring might not be the best idea if you want a productive ground game. So the Chargers very clearly needed to address the running game, and seeing as they had the second pick, and they had a pretty good feeling that the Dallas Cowboys at pick number 1 wouldn't take a running back, seeing as they had Pro Bowler Calvin Hill and Robert Newhouse, they had their eyes set on Bo Matthews. He was there for the taking. The only problem? There was another team that really wanted Matthews, and they played in a completely different league. Because 1 week before the 1974 NFL Draft, the inaugural draft in this league right here, with the amazing Schoolhouse Rock style intro, the upstart World Football League, was held. I've talked about the drama between the WFL and the NFL in a previous video of mine, so if you want to learn more about that, you can do so by clicking the card in the upper right corner. However, with the 4th pick in that draft, the Toronto Northmen would take Matthews, and were willing to give him a fair amount of money to come there and spurn the NFL. Now, after Matthews was drafted by Toronto, he was extremely non-committal, saying, "Football is just one decision. Even when you're on the field, you have to decide which man to block or which hole to run for." In other words, he wasn't saying one way or the other which league he was going to, saying he had a decision to make about where he wanted to settle down and begin the next chapter of his life. However, seeing as Matthews was a hot commodity in both the WFL and the NFL, that meant that he had the possibility of getting into bidding wars. And who do you want representing you in a bidding war? Well, with a big financial decision like that, you want an agent. And that meant that in the days leading up to the draft, Matthews' life looked a lot like this.
Millhouse, baby! Lionel Hutz, your new agent, bodyguard, unauthorized biographer, and drug dealer. Keep her away.
And that's not an exaggeration. He estimated that about 60 agents tried to hound him, bombard his phone, and find him to speak with him and give him right pretty speeches about why he should sign with them. Matthews didn't want to deal with any of that. He didn't want to have agents calling him at every waking hour of the day and hunting him down. So he disconnected his phone and moved to an undisclosed location. In other words, he was in hiding. And that was a problem, because the Chargers wanted to know where Matthews stood before the draft was set to commence, seeing as the last thing they wanted to do, especially with a ton of other running backs on the board like Wilbur Jackson, John Cappelletti, and Barty Smith, was to draft a guy who wasn't going to play in the NFL, and waste their pick on a player who would play no games for them. Don't get me wrong, Matthews was good. The Chargers raved about him. Tom Miner, the chief scout of the team, said that he was a devastating blocker, saying, "He was one of the best blocking backs I've ever seen in my 8 years as a scout." And new head coach Tommy Prothro, who you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner, said on Matthews, "There is a strong possibility that he'll be able to dominate a game the way Larry Zonka does." But despite the high praise, again, you'll want to make sure he actually will play for you and not play in the WFL before making the call. Which is why the Chargers wanted to meet with Matthews. They sent their special assistant, Bob Hood, over to Boulder, Colorado to try and find him, seeing as his phone wasn't working, since he disconnected it. The only problem? They couldn't find him. For days upon days, Hood was searching all throughout town, trying to find any clue of where Matthews was, as he went completely off the grid trying to avoid agents pestering him and possibly trying to take advantage of him. They tried his apartment, but no one answered. They tried other apartments on campus, but either no one answered, or when they did, they found out that Matthews wasn't there. They had no idea what they were talking about. At this point, it was like Hood was trying to play Blue's Clues to figure out where Matthews was. But for a while, there was absolutely nothing doing. No signs of Matthews whatsoever. Finally, and I have no idea how it happened, but Bob Hood went to an off-campus apartment and found Matthews there. Again, I have no details about how the scout knew to look at this place off campus, but from all indications from articles, Matthews was completely alone, just hiding in what must have felt like the world's longest and most tense game of hide and seek. But the drama wasn't done yet, because Hood knocked on the door, and Matthews didn't answer. Matthews stayed silent, and needed some convincing just to open up the door. As Hood would later say, he was hiding because he had about 60 agents after him. He wouldn't answer the door, and he had his phone disconnected. However, once Hood persuaded Matthews to open up the door, probably convincing him that he wasn't an agent, but rather was with the San Diego Chargers, and they wanted to take him in a few days when the time came for them to make their selection, it was smooth sailing. Whatever pitch Hood made to Matthews about playing for the Chargers and playing in the NFL clearly worked, because Matthews was incredibly receptive and was thrilled when the team drafted him, ending any mystery about what league he would play in. Said Matthews, "I'm really excited. I definitely prefer the NFL." Just like that, in the craziest pre-draft saga in Chargers history, where one assistant coach had to search the entire city to find the man in hiding, the Chargers got Matthews' word and drafted him. Which raises the question, was this all worth it? Well, not quite. In fact, he's widely regarded today as one of the biggest busts in the history of the Chargers franchise. He's not the biggest, because I think that one's pretty obvious, seeing as he rhymes with Brian Chief, but he's up there, that's for sure. In 6 seasons with the Chargers, Matthews only had 1,372 rushing yards and 11 rushing touchdowns. Only once did he ever have more than 300 rushing yards in a single season, when he posted 328 as a rookie in 1974. In his final 3 seasons with the Chargers, he scored just 1 touchdown, and after 6 unproductive seasons in San Diego, found himself on the New York Giants in 1980 and 1981, and the Miami Dolphins in 1981, before never playing in the NFL after that, although he did try briefly to stick around in the USFL. This was not what the Chargers envisioned when they drafted him. Not at all. He did not take over games like Larry Zonka. That high hope that Prothro had was never realized. As one teammate said on Matthews, he was not a real motivated guy. He was lazy. But if you think that's the end of the story, think again. Because apparently, even though Matthews was not a great pro football player, he was fantastic at disappearing. In 1998, the San Diego Chargers had the number 2 pick in the NFL draft, and one newspaper tried to do a story interviewing Matthews, seeing as he was chosen the last time the Chargers had the number 2 pick. And amazingly enough, they couldn't find him either. The Chargers had no idea. None of his former teammates had any idea. An internet search revealed nothing. His high school football coach, supposedly one of Matthews' closest friends, had no idea, and hadn't talked to him in 15 years. Not even the NFL Players Association knew, even though Matthews qualified for pension. Seriously, I don't know how Matthews pulled this off a second time, but he somehow did. Because even though Bo Matthews did not have a great NFL career, and was far from the greatest Charger of all time, he might have the greatest disappearing act of any Charger ever. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.